to our final Xamarin workshop session before the holiday break. Thank you guys for coming. I know I rescheduled it, and I apologize for the inconvenience, but I'm glad you guys made it out tonight. So thanks to our sponsor, Microsoft. Without them, we wouldn't have this room and we wouldn't be able to run workshops like this, so give them a little shout out. All right, last time we were here, we talked about activities, and more so like that comprised an application and running on Android, but we didn't really get into talking about the UI elements, and that's what today is going to be about. And you can have a seat anywhere. So essentially, a layout is what defines the UI that you see in the window of an application. It's made up of one or more views, essentially, or view group objects. And in Android, you're going to find out very quickly that every UI element that you see derives from view in some sort of way. Right? So everything relates back to a view object. So on this, like in this example, on this UI, you'll see you can very quickly see that there's a couple of scrollable lists and some labels. Every single thing that's comprised on here is a view, and then but the types of views that they've been extended to have a custom behavior in some way. So Android provides over like 140 different types of built-in views that you can use to build out your layout, but you can also extend those views, and that's a talk for a different day. So to define a layout, you can kind of handle it in one of two ways. You can declare elements in an XML file and then load that in when the activity loads. That file must be saved as an XML extension, and you must place that file in the resources layout directory in your project. So where that file goes matters, because that's how Android recognizes it as a layout resource. It will generate a unique ID for that layout, and then you can use that to access the layout at runtime. And I'll show you how to do that. You can also instantiate elements at runtime in the layout, so you can programmatically add elements to a layout when you're running with it, or when you're running the activity. You can actually add directly to a view, the activity's view. You can also manipulate those UI elements at runtime. So similar to like when you're working in Windows Forms or various whatever applications you're used to developing, usually you can affect change in the element while the code's running, changing color, text, size. You can do the same thing in Android programmatically in the activity when it's running. So the advantages of defining your layout in XML over just programmatically adding the elements and structuring your application that way or your UI that way. Obviously, separating the presentation layer from the code, that's a really big deal. And that becomes useful later when you want to include that layout maybe in other activities. You want to reuse layouts, or have small components that you use across your UI or in different applications. You can pull that in. It doesn't have any code tying it to that project, so that's really nice. You also can define layouts for screen orientations, device sizes, and languages as well. And there's a way to do that in the resources section of how you separate out layouts. So we'll talk about that when we dig into the project. And it's just easier to look at and understand what your layout is going to look like when you're looking at it in XML format. There's also a designer in Visual Studio, so you can actually view how it's going to run without running it, which is really nice as well. And you won't get that in code. So it just makes it a lot easier to work with that way. Especially with some complicated layouts where you have nested elements and a number of controls in the form to render. So let's go through some of the layout containers, but these are going to be the things that you're going to use. That's going to be the foundation of your layouts, the UI and Android. So there are multiple container layouts, but I like to call them layouts or layout containers. So there's linear layout, which allows you to arrange child elements either horizontally or vertically. You just simply specify the orientation, and it's just like a single column or single row. So if it's vertically, it'll be one column, and if it's horizontally, it'll be one row, but that's how the elements will be laid across. Relative layout, you can position children with respect to one another. that's if you have like a layout which requires some more fine grain control and positioning of elements. So if you think of maybe like, you know, if you have like a rotary dialer that you created this really cool application, and it's going to look like an old staff rotary dialer phone, if anyone remembers that. Okay, yes, we do. And and so the way that it's laid out, you know, you could say you have this central element, which is like the button in the middle that just shows information, and then each other element you can position above or below that, and then with the corresponding numbers, you can say you can position it to the left or right of the other elements, kind of thing. So then eventually you can get this like circular look. So relatively, it would do that a little bit more, that nice control, but still a very dealing with UI elements in a flexible way. And frame layout is used to just block out an area on the screen to display like a single item. That can be useful if you just want to load a different layout or an item at runtime. So say like I've separated out a layout control that I want to use, but I want to load it at runtime, and then I can just kind of reference that frame layout and load that in at that point, or just to block out some space. And grid layout places children like obviously in grid format, rectangular grid. So you have columns and rows. You can specify the number of columns and rows that you want, which is nice. And then absolute layout, you actually have to specify like hard-coded values, the coordinates of where you want your elements placed. And this is a layout that I stay away from using because it's so inflexible and it's really not conducive to when you're thinking about designing a UI that could run in portrait or orientation mode, and you're hard-coding these coordinates. It's not going to look very nice. So my recommendation is just, you know it's there, but stay away from it at all costs if possible. You know, usually one of the other layout controls that are available will satisfy your needs. Absolutely, I cannot think of a good reason to use it unless you're using like a drawing application or something like that, but even so, I don't know. I haven't found a reason to use it. Okay. And then when dealing with data sets, so you know, obviously a lot of applications deal with collections of data. You have recycler view, which is a nice way to display lists. That requires some additional wiring and setup for defining the adapter that will feed the data in. That's beyond the scope of today's talk, but I just want to make you aware that is there. There's also grid view and list view. So that will be a different workshop because there are different pieces to get those working together. But today we're just going to have a very kind of introductory look into layouts, and then the workshop will help you start digging in and understanding how those controls are used. So just like with when you're designing whether web apps or Windows Forms, WPF, or other mobile apps, there's always the standard input controls. Android's no different. You have buttons, you have text fields, checkboxes, spinner controls, and date pickers, time pickers, those kinds of things. All these things can be found on the developer documentation site. I'm not going to go through every single one extensively. The most common ones you're going to be using, obviously, are the buttons, the various style buttons, the various style text fields. You have images as well, like the image view, and checkboxes and stuff. So the way that you can implement them is pretty standard, and it's easy to find specific properties that you need on the documentation site and on an as-needed basis. Because if I were to go through every single one today, we'd be here all night. So when you're defining your UI elements in your layout file, there are attributes that you are going to have to include in order to define how your control is laid out, how it looks. At a minimum, you definitely need to indicate the width and height of every UI element. If you don't, your project won't compile at all. Like you'll compile and you get errors. You won't be able to do it in the design or get errors. It'll bark at you for not including that. And so in Android, in order to define width and height, you have to use something called layout parameters. And that simply means that in the XML, the attribute is like layout underscore width, layout underscore height. But there's a ton of other layout parameters that are available. Things like understanding like placement of the control. So there's something called gravity, which defines how much of the space and where and the location what the UI it's going to fill up. So I can say layout underscore gravity is going to be fill vertical, and then that will fill the vertical space of whatever container it's within. Or I could say layout gravity center, and that will center it within the container that it is in. So there's different types of layout parameters. I'm pointing out width and height mainly because that's required. You have to specify those. When you're specifying layout width and height, you can specify the special values that are provided. So match parent means that it will expand to the size of the container it's in. Wrap content will mean that it will only display as much of the control as is needed to size to the content that it's displaying. And you can also specify like a fixed size. So if I just want it to be 24 dp, I can specify that as well. So that's the variation with defining your properties here. And you'll see that with other Android attributes as well. Layout gravity will, obviously have special values, and you can look those up on the documentation to see what are exactly all of the gravity properties I can set. What do they do? How do they affect change when I set it on this control? Are there any questions so far?
A question for later, perhaps, but
okay.
Yeah.
All right. So when you're designing your UI, obviously you want to define what elements that appear on the screen, but you also want to define how it looks. Is there a style that I want to apply, or the colors that I want to set the text to or the background to? Strings are also resources that you can define separately and then use within your view. Any resource you define, you can store it in an XML file, and that must go on the resources values directory. And we'll take a look at how some of those XML files look and how you can declare them and use them in your layout. So let's just jump into. So here within my Android project, and this is essentially going to be the project you guys are going to be working with. I have a starter project of this, and you're going to recreate this layout. It just has a single layout called main.xml, main.xml. And what it looks like in the designer is that it's just going to be a simple calculator. I know it's pretty ugly, but I figured it combined some of the elements that would be good to kind of get you started and understanding how to set and define properties and laying out some of the controls. So here I'm using a grid layout, and as you can see, I've defined the Android namespace in my layout file. That's really important. You definitely need to have that in your root element so that you can reference all of the Android attributes within your layout. And then as you can see here, I'm setting the width and height, the layout width and height to match parent. So that means it's going to, the grid view is going to expand to the full screen size. Because it's the only element that I have. It's like the only layout element that I have, and I want everything within it to maximize space. And I'm setting a margin, and you can see here that my margin is not referencing a number, but it's actually referencing a resource. This resource type is a dimension. And to reference dimensions, I have to prefix it with @dimen, and then the name of the dimension that I gave it. That dimension is stored, again, in the values directory. It's simply an XML file. And it's referenced as a resource. And you can see the XML element name is dimen, right? So the element name it indicates to Android, this is a special element that it's looking for. And then when I'm referencing it to layout, when I say @dimen, it knows that it needs to look for dimension value. So it's going to check my XML resources that exist for that value, that name.
Is the element name is going in front of the file name?
Pardon?
The file name is dimen as well, right? Is that?
It doesn't have to be.
Right.
I can actually, I just do this for cleanliness and for ease of use to find my stuff, but I can actually define, right within here, I can say color, and then name, and then red, and then whatever value I want. I can mix and match the elements in here but just for me, I like to keep everything separate and I just name the file accordingly because I just find it's easier to find things. So yeah, the name of the file does not affect how it's referenced. And same with color, you can see it's, I'm just doing this to group my like typed, or like my like-minded resources together, essentially. So, yeah, so that's where it's pulling that value from. So you can see I've defined, predefined some sizes. These are the general sizes that I want throughout my application. So that way I don't have to like hard code a lot of these values throughout the layout. If I decide, well, I don't like the way this sizing looks, I can change it simply by changing it in my XML file where I define that dimension value, and then it'll just flow across. And if you're used to XAML development, if you've done WPF or Silverlight, a lot of this will be very familiar because we do the same thing with defining resources and values that we can use throughout the views in the application in one spot. And then in order to reduce a lot of the hard coding and custom values per view, it just makes it easier to skin applications, theme them how you want. So in a grid layout, I also have a special attribute specifically for grid layout called column count. There's also row count, but I don't even think I need to define row count here. Generally, if I just say column count, every element that I add to it within the grid layout as a child element, it knows that there has to be 4 columns across, so what it'll do is in the order that the elements appear, it's going to start slotting them in those slots, and then once it hits column 4, it's going to go to the next row, and then the next row, and the next row. So it really doesn't matter if I define row count, like I just removed it, and you'll see it won't affect the view at all. It's still the same. So my very first element is a text view, and I'm having that span 4 columns because I want it to take the entire first row. So I specify a layout attribute called column span. And the good thing about working in Visual Studio right now is we do have some sort of IntelliSense on the Android designer. So if I'm not sure what the name is, I can just say layout underscore, and you can start seeing the elements coming up. There. So it's really nice. You have a bit of an IntelliSense. It helps you if you're not sure. You're like, I think it's called this. You can check that out and then just use it. Style, and you notice that there is no Android prefix on it. So this is a style on the element. What this means is I can define common style that I want to apply across all text views or across some text views or buttons or any other element. And instead of repeating that same set of attributes that cross all these elements, so I say I know every text view is going to have width and height that match parent or have content. Every text view is going to have a font size of this or color of this.
So it's sort of like CSS.
Yes. So yeah, instead of defining it every time I define a text view, I can create a style. And again, style is an XML resource. It's a little bit different in that I define this style name, or I define a style, I give it a name, and then I have to add child elements to it. And each item in the child element is a valid Android property attribute on the view.
And can you have multiple styles? So could you assign default calc style and calc button style to one element?
Yeah, so this style, I'm just saying default calc style, this is just setting the text size, the layout width and height. But then on the button style, this calc button style, something I defined, I'm like, well, I really like the text size layout width of the default style. So that's going to be the parent. So that means this calc button style is going to inherit these values. But then I'm going to customize it a little bit. So actually the width of each button in the calculator is only going to be 80 dp wide. So I'm customizing it a little bit. So you can see it's already defined up here as wrap content, but I'm overriding it in the calc button style. And then I'm setting the background and a margin, essentially. Again, this just keeps the layout a lot cleaner, so I don't have to repeat defining these attributes since they're gonna be the same across all the elements that I'm using for, you know, a button or a text view. And that may not be the case. You may have different styles. So you may have like a header text view and you want to define a style for that, and then a footer, list item elements, and you can have like any number of styles defined in here for all the different representations that you want to use in your application. And you can have any number of items, so one or more, but just be cognizant that if you are creating a style and you're referencing an item that is only specific to a certain type of view, you can't apply that style to other views that don't have that attribute. So say like I created a style for a grid layout and its column count is very specific to grid layout. I can't then apply that style to a text view because it doesn't have a column count, so it doesn't make sense, right?
You get an error if you did that, or?
I believe you get a compile error,
It won't just ignore it.
or I don't think it will. Let's try it. So, any questions so far while waiting for this to build?
Where's the project for the calculator?
Where's the project? Oh, I'll put the link to download it. Oh, it did. It just ignored it. Okay, cool. I learned something today. Yeah, it did just ignore it, so that's pretty sweet. Okay. Yay. So back here. Okay, so the similar thing applies with defining the rest of the elements of the screen. I'm simply just hard coding the text for my calculator, which isn't recommended if you're thinking about localizing your application, but that's a talk for a different day. Ideally, I could have just put these values in the strings file and then referenced it that way as like an string2, and then that way I've had multiple languages, like even like Arabic. I mean, they don't use the number 2, they have it's a different character actually. Then that would work better. So, but for simplicity, I just have it listed there as is. And then in some cases, you'll even see I'm using gravity. So here I'm saying fill horizontal, because I'm asking the button to take up like 2 columns. If I didn't specify fill horizontal, the button would not stretch that far out. So I'll take that out and go to the designer. So in some cases you have to play around with the variations of wrap content, fill parent, using gravity as well, to get the look that you want. And a lot of times it just takes that playing around with the different layout parameters to find out what works. Okay. So there's that. So we looked at color, we looked at dimensions, we looked at styles. Another thing I wanted to point out, but I'm not going to get too deep into today, is the button style. I'm setting the background to something called a button selector, which is a drawable resource. This is like a special type of drawable resource, which is an XML file. And the reason that I have to do this is if I want the button to look like, if I want the button to apply different visual color or a visual state so that the user knows it pressed it, here that's what I'm doing. So this is just a basic button, so I'm going to use color to denote that when it's pressed and then when it's not pressed. if I didn't do that, you wouldn't see that representation when tapping on it. So the only way you'd know something's happening is if you see an immediate reaction. Like in the calculator, if I press the button, sure, a value will come up, but I still like the user to see that highlighted, so because it gives them a nicer experience. So in this case, I create something called a selector, and within the selector, I can define the different states that apply. So when the button is pressed, so when state pressed is true, I'm going to set that drawable to be a specific color. And then when it's not pressed, then the default would just be a different color. And so what happens then? So you can see, if I didn't include that, when I press a button, you wouldn't even notice it. The only thing that you would note is just you'd see the number out here, but you wouldn't see that highlight go back and forth. And so that is going to be in the project for you, like in the sample project as well, just for your reference, because it's something that's worth looking into. So if you had an image button and you wanted a different image to display when they press, you can set that here as well. You can do the same kind of pattern. And there's also different states, like state enabled. There's no IntelliSense here on this one, which is too bad. But there's different states, so depending on the type of control you're using or the state that it would be in, you can research that a bit as well and apply that. It's very nice to have. So once you've defined an XML layout, you want to be able to use it within an activity. And in order to do that, you have to set the content view of the activity to the layout that you want to use. So when the activity is running, if you remember from the last workshop, there's a method called onCreate that is triggered, and that's where you can initialize a lot of things and set up your UI. Well, there was a method that's called setContentView where you pass in the ID of the layout in order for the activity to load it. Once the layout is loaded, if you want to have receive a handle to any of the elements that are in the layout, you can simply retrieve a handle by calling findViewById within the activity. And T stands for like the object type, essentially. So if I wanted to get a handle to the text view, I'd say findViewById, open bracket text view, close angle bracket, and then I pass in the parameter of its resource ID. So it would be resource.layout.main, because that's the unique identifier that Android automatically has generated and then saved it to that kind of constant variable, essentially, that I can use. It's an easy way of accessing a layout ID without having to.
Good evening and welcome to Central Library. Please join us in our reading lounge at 7 p.m. for seasonal music by piano duo Dave and Joyce Kanar. This re-performance starts in 15 minutes, so please join us. Thank you.
I'm going. Okay. So yeah, so every time that you add elements or any kind of resources in your Android project, layouts, and you know, it will automatically create this unique ID, and then, but an easy way to access it using like the resource mechanism. So resource.id would be for accessing elements in your view that you've given it an ID for. I'll show you that again in a second. Layouts would be resource.layout, drawables would be resource.drawable. You get the, right? And then same with colors, strings, you can access them all programmatically that way. Yeah, so once you have the handle to like your text view or button or whatever, you can affect change in it by programmatically setting its properties. You can wire events to it in the code behind as well, and interact with it how you need. So let's take a look at that. So in my onCreate override, you can see I'm setting the content view to resource.layout.main. Yeah, so as there's nothing else really there, but if I had like 20 different layouts, you know, you can use IntelliSense to find it as well. That pops up really nicely. And then you can see I'm getting a handle to my text view. I'm using that find view by ID text view, and then I'm accessing it through an ID. To provide an ID for an element in the view, you simply set the ID property on the element. But you must specify it in this way. So it's noting that it's an ID property, but then there's this plus sign, which means that you're kind of creating this ID for this element. So when you're creating an element and you want to name it, you have to say @+ID. If I'm in like a relative layout and I've created this element and I want this element to be below it, I would have like an attribute to say layout below. And in order to reference this ID, I would say @ID expression text without the plus sign. So that means I'm referencing an ID that already exists. It's very, I know it's strange to get, it's something that you have to get used to it, but yeah. Whenever you want to add a new ID or name an object, make sure you just include that plus sign. Okay. So that, in effect, then generated like a unique ID that I can reference from here. And you can see that it's just simply, you can just simply reference it using the variable name. I can go into this, because I love Visual Studio for this, but I can say peak definition, and you can see in the Resources Designer class that it generated that constant variable for me, and give it that unique ID. That Resources Designer class is always like updated every time you add or remove elements. So it's constantly auto-generating, so don't manually change that. So there we go. So I set my content view. I reference the handle to one of the elements in the layout, and then I just work with it. For this demo project, I just used a NuGet package that someone created called NCalc, which actually handles evaluating the math expression, just because I wanted you guys to focus more on building the layout rather than actually adding the functionality, because you're smart enough to do that, but it's just too time consuming for the workshop. Now there's also something else I wanted to point out. For each button click, I have defined the on-click event to be calc button pressed. That's the name I've given it. Unlike in Windows projects, when you define an event, it's like you expect it to pass an object and event types. But if I'm defining the on-click method through the layout, it just expects a view. And I also have to provide this attribute to indicate to Android that I want to export that event handler, so that that's included and it knows to wire up that event to that method. In order to use java.interrupt.export, I have to manually add a reference to mono Android export. So if you are wiring up event handlers in that way in Android from the layout, add a reference to mono.android.export, and then include your event handler in your code, like that attribute java.interrupt.export, passing in the name of your event handler.
How does she know which one to choose?
I don't think it mattered. I think I don't know why I have it here multiple times. I just selected one, and the placement of where I selected it, because I selected the first one, and now it's showing the third one. I don't know what's happened there. I think I have too many different things installed on here. Should only be one, so I don't know. I have a lot of cleaning to do on my machine.
I've seen the name was saying F# core, on the right. On the right column.
On the right.
It's just the one that's highlighted at the very top. Right, there you go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay.
true, yeah.
So the very top one was F sharp.
Oh, okay.
So that's why I just stayed when she just scrolled down.
So there are multiples of the same version, so it's 185 or 186. And I have like installed and reinstalled and updated a ton of times on this machine, so this might be just residual from that. But yeah, so mono.android to export for that case. As you get further down this path and in developing with Xamarin, I highly recommend looking into Mvvm frameworks like Mvvm Cross or Mvvm Lite, which then like removes the need to do something like this, because then you can use binding to bind your event to your view model and then not have to worry about this specifically. It's kind of be behind the scenes and you won't have to deal with it. But just for focusing on layout today and kind of these nuances that you'll have to work with, it's still good to know about it and know how to work with it for now. But I definitely highly recommend, beyond this, implementing an Mvvm pattern and framework.
What was that, you said cross, what was it?
Mvvm Cross and Mvvm Lite.
Are they similar libraries or completely different?
They're completely different. Mvvm Lite is very lightweight. It's got a lot of really good functionality. Mvvm Cross is kind of has more to it, but they've made it more modularized. So there's NuGet packages for different parts that you want to use.
Okay, I have a question, I'll ask you later.
Okay. And if you're working in Xamarin Forms, there's also Prism, which is available for Xamarin Forms only right now. That's an open source library that's managed by Brian Lagunas and a couple of other developers. And they're constantly updating it as well. So if you get into Xamarin Forms, definitely look into Prism.
Is the same prism that was used in the, I think, Silverlight or something? I remember they had you are talking about the Mvvm framework, yeah?
Yeah. Yeah, I think what they did was they kind of developed this one for Xamarin Forms. I'm not sure how much of it they've reused from Silverlight, but...
Because that one was pretty impressive, I mean, with the patterns they were using and everything.
Yeah, and you should see the way Prism with Xamarin Forms is now, all the different things you can do with it. It's very sophisticated and it works really nicely. And even Miguel at Evolved said if you're developing with Xamarin Forms, like he was on the stage and said, use Prism. Definitely, like if Miguel gives his approval on it, then you know it's good. So there's that. Okay, and I think that's really all I wanted to show. So I think that's a good start to designing your layouts. So you're going to spend the next half an hour-ish, maybe 35 minutes, because we're here till 7:30. Clone or download my GitHub repo. And then in the layouts directory is where the starter project is and the completed project. There's 2 PDFs in that directory as well. One of the PDFs is this slide deck, and the other PDF is the workshop step-by-step. So that way you have access to the additional resources slide, which is at the very end of the fundamentals PDF. That will help you not only as you're navigating through tonight, but also if you're digging in once you leave here. It gives you some really great resource links to follow up on and look through. So make sure you make use of that. And if you have any questions, raise your hand.
Sure, so the company that I'm working for, a small company, we're making our first Xamarin app. I mean, another developer are going to be working on it. I don't know as much into it, but we tried to get an Mvvm in Xamarin Forms, and we realized today that there's no data picker control that's findable. It's hard to believe, and I started Googling it, and it's true. So we just want to know does Prism have all that? Except it's not in the Xamarin Forms library itself.
Prism wouldn't have a control that's bindable. Prism simply exposes or makes available a lot of the commonalities of binding to the Xamarin Forms controls that are available, and messaging, and like subscribing to events, things like that. Like some of the common patterns that you see in MVVM, like navigation. But I don't think it provides its own custom control. MVVM Cross may provide that, because MVVM Cross is pretty extensive.
And then I guess the other question we had, we're trying to figure out, we're kind of on deadlines, we're probably able to just find something that works, but is that going to be added to Xamarin Forms in the future, or why is there all these third-party, why isn't there, like, even the ASP.NET has a windable drop-down list, for example. There's a drop-down list in Xamarin, but it doesn't wind to.
I don't know.
I thought that was very strange, because this is a new technology. We just want to know if, so you said Cross and Prism and things to look into, and it's pretty much hopefully, okay.
You could also extend the control yourself and create a dependency property.
You see things like that, there's complications with the back button and things, and whatever it is, and state, and these are problems that we thought we shouldn't have to solve.
I can go back and ask someone that's in Xamarin, and I can put a question up to James Montemagno, and then see if I can get a good answer on that.
Okay.
And then if you leave me with your contact information, then I can get back to you.
I like that, yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Just if anyone else is built in, we don't have the experience, so.
Yeah.
And your samples, those are not Xamarin Forms samples?
No, I'm strictly, this is a native, yeah.
Okay, would you recommend people stay away from forms? Or we thought we'd save time, to release something to the public, through government, through iPhone and Android.
I find that Xamarin Forms now is more mature than it was 6 months ago, a year ago. It's just constantly getting better. Some of the things that you can do to work around some of the headaches that you have, you can build custom renders. That's a little bit tedious. You can embed native controls if you want. If the biggest problem you have is that you can't bind to the control, I'd say just programmatically deal with it for now. But yeah, there's different things that you can do where you have more fine-grained control over Xamarin Forms because of where it's at today.
But then, once you're doing like custom filters, are you not developing that basically twice per platform? Extending it a little bit on the Mac?
Yeah. You will have to, I think with Xamarin Forms, even using the built-in controls, you'll find in some cases you'll have to tweak them per platform regardless. Just the look and like how it looks, where the placement is.
So we have to decide maybe it's not ready for enterprise use. I don't know. Something where a question popped up today.
I definitely think it still is worth looking into and will save you a lot of time. A lot of those platform tweaks can be done right within the XAML definition. You can just say on platform, if it's iOS, maybe change like the padding or the spacing, or you know what I mean, like for custom like mini tweaks like that, it's really good, and you can do that programmatically as well. It is a lot better as far as performance than it used to be. They have made quite a bit of performance improvements in Xamarin Forms. I would just say take a look at what the pain points are and kind of weigh that with the effort to go native versus Xamarin Forms. Like if the only problem that you have is you can't bind to it right now, and you have to set things programmatically, you're still further ahead using Xamarin Forms than you are using native. Because even if you're using native, you're going to have to hook up Mvvm Cross or Mvvm Lite to get that binding, and there is still some legwork to do. In Mvvm Lite, you won't get binding in the UI. You'll have to do it in code. In Mvvm Cross, you can get the binding in Android UI, but in iOS, you still have to do it in code.
And what is Prism then?
Pardon?
Prism, what's that then?
Prism is another Mvvm framework that gives you messaging, navigation,
Which pretty much every app needs.
the binding, so it does give you everything that you need. There's also just a built-in dependency service in Xamarin as well, which you can use for dependency injection, which Prism also, I believe, has built-in dependency injection. But yeah, if you go to native and you want to include binding, and you want the binding in the layout, Mvvm Cross is as close as you're going to get. but not for iOS. iOS, you'll still have to do the binding of the code, and then that work is extensive as well.
So, and the cross isn't, it's not cross-platform necessarily.
No, MVVM cross is Xamarin.
The bindings for it, so.
So you'd have to add an MVVM cross package to your Android project, to your iOS project, and then to your portable class libraries in order for it to all work together, because it has platform-specific implementations as well as.
Oh, okay, so we're adding, like, it's kind of an assembly or something.
Yeah.
It's not really a huge deal.
It's not a huge deal, but there is
Okay.
legwork. And like I said, like, if you're concerned about binding or not having binding for some of the pickers or combos and have to do it in code, well, with MVVM Cross and iOS, you have to write all your bindings in code. You're only going to be able to add bindings to your layout in Android within the layout file, and that's so that to keep it out of your code and keep it cleaner.
Yeah.
But with iOS, you're still going to have to write those bindings in code. You can't add it to the storyboard. So you're still further up ahead in Xamarin Forms if that's the thing.
Okay.
Yeah, there's pros and cons in each, and like you just have to weigh it.
Well, we'll really appreciate that.
Yeah, anytime.
Files on Xamarin Forms do? Like that same format?
No, those XML files are specific for Android, the Android platform.
Yeah.
So if you're creating a Xamarin Forms project, and in your Xamarin Android project, you're creating native layouts as well as using Xamarin Forms layouts. In your native layouts, you can use those resources, but in your Xamarin Forms layouts, you won't be able to. Because your Xamarin Forms layouts are designed to like use only the common pieces across all the platforms. So you may have access to like 40 different controls that are Xamarin Forms controls, and when they compile down to native controls.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to be able to access any Android-specific resources at that level.
Alright. And there's nothing equivalent to do that for both iOS and Android. Like just have it there in the shared.
Well, that's just what Xamarin Forms is for. So your resources, your shared resources would then be in Xamarin Forms, and they would just be defined in a different way. They'd be defined in Xamarin instead of in the XML
Right.
Android layout.
Okay.
So that's what you would apply instead.
Okay.
So then if you want like specific Android stuff with Xamarin Forms, you cannot do it, yeah?
You'd have to embed the native control in Xamarin Forms. And so you can do that. Like now it supports embedding native right in Xamarin Forms. So you can say, I want this specific Android control in there, and I want this specific iOS control in there. You could do that. So it does support that. Before you used to have to write a custom renderer, which then you'd have to have all this, kind of bootstrap code to get it to load the native control, but now you can just directly embed the native control within Xamarin Forms, and depending on the platform, it knows which one to load. We'll have sessions on Xamarin Forms too. Like I figure we'll do, I did a couple on Android, we'll do a couple on iOS, then I'll do a couple on Xamarin Forms to round out the year, just so that you have that intro piece of the main parts of getting started with each one. I think that'll be good.
How about Android material design?
Yeah, that's included in Xamarin. That's everything that is released with Android is available in Xamarin not too long after it's released, and same with iOS. And Xamarin's really good with keeping up to date with the iOS updates. So you do have, you can apply material design into your Android projects. It's everything's included. So, and then there are support libraries which you can add for a lot of the newer controls. Like Recycler View is in the support library, I believe, in version 7. That's an additional package you add into your project. It's a NuGet package you install.
Yeah.
And then you use it.
So you could have done this design in material,
Yeah.
if you wanted to.
Yeah, and there's like, you have access to like the floating action button or like the little snack bar that they call in Android. That's all part of the material design as well, like these controls. You have access to those as well. So, yeah, they're really good with keeping up to date with the Android and iOS releases. So you're never far behind at all. Like you actually are pretty good. So then you can go straight like to the project info site or the documentation. And I know the guys that work on this project, they're always happy to answer questions. So if you're on Twitter, just tweet at them.
Okay.
If you have questions, you run into issues, and I'm sure they will answer you back if there's a problem. So, and they're constantly working on it and making updates and stuff. So you'll always see updated 5 days ago. They're really good with adding stuff to it. It's definitely worth going on. It's just a GitHub Prism library for such Prism.
Yeah, I was hesitant because I didn't know.
Yeah, and I completely understand that. I've always erred on the side of caution. I stuck with the native layouts, Prism, and then you just add it in, and then you can even pick what computer you want, like Unity or Mac, and then there's Prism Core. But you should be able to find some documentation as well on how to implement it in your Xamarin project. There should be blog posts too. I know Brian has specifically himself blogged about how to use it as well.
Okay. Yeah, I'm sure I'll find some videos.
Yeah. Oh yeah, he's even created an extension pack for Visual Studio, which comes with some pre-canned templates that you can, so when you're creating your project, it'll build all that boilerplate code for you right up front. And then you can just create one like that from scratch as well. So that might be worthwhile as well, because I always find the boilerplate code I learn a lot from.
Right, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then you can apply it to your project. View on another linear layout. So I have a linear layout that's vertical, and then it would have a text view as its first child element. The next element would be a linear layout that's horizontal, and within that horizontal linear layout, I could have done some buttons, and then did that again and again and again, right? So I could have done that as well as an option. So it's, even though the example uses a grid layout, it's not hard and fast, right? There are different ways you can apply layouts. I try to use the view that's going to give me the cleanest UI with the least amount of nested layouts as possible. Because I find that as you nest layers deep, the performance and the overdraw on Android can be pretty bad. So that's just generally what I'm thinking about creating layouts. I think, what's the most optimal way I can render this without having multiple nested elements? But it's not to say you can't have nested elements, and you will find yourself in situations where you are nesting layouts within each other and other items.